I'm joined today by Tim Wise. He's an anti-racist educator and author of 6 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. Tim, it's really great to have you on. And recently, we've had so much of a blowback to a segment we did addressing Bill O'Reilly's comment that he has never been the recipient or beneficiary of white privilege. And Bill O'Reilly's comment, combined with the feedback I've gotten after we covered that story, really confirms to me that a lot of people don't seem to really understand the concept of white privilege. So let's start there broadly, and then we'll drill down to some of the specifics.
Sure. Well, the first thing that's a little bit ironic about Bill O'Reilly specifically not acknowledging white privilege is that, for people who know a little bit about his background, he grew up in a decidedly middle-class community, but it was Levittown. It was Long Island. And this is a community that, like the other Levittowns, there were a few, that was the second one, were constructed by their designer and their developers specifically to be racially exclusive. In other words, he grew up in a community where black and brown folks literally were not allowed to live. So the idea that he didn't have white privilege growing up really flies in the face of his own biography. So that's the first sort of interesting point. But the bigger issue, and I think it's the one your question speaks to, is that when we talk about white privilege generally, we don't even have to get as material as better housing or better jobs or higher income, although I think there's plenty of evidence that white folks have advantages in those arenas, both historically, which most people would agree with, but even today. I think it's actually more about the sort of day-to-day subtle psychological advantages that a person who is white has. The idea that as a white person, I'm not going to be presumed incompetent when I'm applying for a job. If anything, I'll be presumed competent until proven otherwise, especially if I'm white and male, and especially if I'm upper middle class and went to the quote unquote right colleges. It means that as a white person, I'm going to be presumed law abiding until proven otherwise. And when I do commit a crime, my race and my racial background will play no role in the mainstream explanation of that. Elliot Rodgers' shooting spree in California, a very good example of someone who, although his mother is Asian, he was very white identified. In fact, he talked about hating that part of himself that wasn't fully white. And so when he does that, or when the school shooters at Columbine or any of the sort of mass murderers and spree killers who are disproportionately white do what they do, no one ever attributes that to white culture. We don't even know what white culture is. If black folks do that, we ascribe it to some underclass ghetto pathology, quote unquote, that's very specifically about the black community. So white privilege is just the ability to be viewed as an individual, not as a member of a collective, and to get the benefit of the doubt when you're applying for that loan, when you're applying for that job, when you're sitting in that classroom, when you're interacting with a cop. That's a much more intangible thing in some ways than material benefits, but it has very tangible outcomes and effects.
And with regard to Bill O'Reilly, I think there's an interesting example there as well, because if you imagine the Bill O'Reilly physically imposing, loud, angry, a bully, very, very aggressive, his behavior, and by that, that's the description of him on his program, let me be clear. However he is in real life, we don't know. If he were black instead of white, those behavior traits would be analyzed through the lens of race. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, it might mean that he wouldn't get the interviews he gets, or that he would get fired or wouldn't get fired. It doesn't really matter. It's not material. But because he is white, his personality traits are not in any way seen through the lens of race. And I think that even that's how we could apply it specifically to Bill O'Reilly.
Absolutely right. I mean, if you think, here's a guy who, in his sort of famous, the first interview he did with the president, where he interrupted the president, I think something like 30 times or something. It was a big story about how sort of fundamentally rude he was to the president. If you can imagine sort of the black or brown equivalent of a Bill O'Reilly, and I'm not sure who that would, let's think of somebody like Tavis Smiley, right, who has interviewed presidents, both white and black, never would, first of all, Tavis's personality is not as aggressive, but Tavis can be, he's a journalist who asks hard questions. Imagine if he had interrupted George W. Bush, or if he were old enough to have interviewed Ronald Reagan and had interrupted Ronald Reagan 30 some odd times, or if Roland Martin did now, or if Michael Eric Dyson, were to do that. I think any honest person would have to acknowledge that that would be viewed quite a bit differently than someone like Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly can be bellicose and he can be sort of arrogant, and people might write it off to him and they might say, God, he's sort of a jerk, but it's never going to be looked at, as you said, through a group lens, and that's the difference.
I want to talk now a little bit about what have been the pushbacks to the concept of white privilege that we've seen over recent years. One common theme I'm seeing in the reaction I get from the conservative side of my audience is that the concept of white privilege is one that is used to be racist against white people. And as absurd as it is at its face, I'm looking for effective ways to communicate with people who think that, right? Because there's no advantage to just arguing and yelling and screaming. How might we communicate with someone who maybe sincerely believes that the concept of white privilege is a construct to discriminate against people for being white, either as some kind of revenge or for whatever other reason? How do you rationalize a conversation with someone like that?
Well, first of all, if we're going to look for evidence of racism, like I think you have to break this down into component parts. If I'm looking for evidence of racism against black people, for instance, I look for data suggesting that there's something happening to black people that can perhaps be attributed to racism. So you're looking at, where does the evidence lead you? What is the evidence that whiteness or white privilege as a concept has actually led to, or is leading to, or even could lead to, the disempowerment of white people? How is noting a sociological truth that certain people on balance and on average have advantages in the labor market going to result in discrimination against them? Now, it may lead to greater equal opportunity efforts, which unfortunately for a lot of white folks, they perceive that as discrimination.
Well, that was going to be my example. If I said what you just said to me, right, to some of these folks, they would say, look at affirmative action. That's exactly how it's translated into an anti-white policy.
Right. And yet the problem being that whites, for instance, are still more likely, according to all the research, to get into our first choice college quicker than black folks, quicker than Latino folks. So we don't actually lose our edge. And of course, here's the thing about white privilege. In schooling, white folks from kindergarten through 12th grade, senior year of high school, according to all the data, far more likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers, far less likely to attend crowded, resource-poor schools, far more likely to have access to honors and advanced placement classes. So we've actually had 13 years of, in effect, systemic affirmative action before we ever apply to college. And then all of a sudden we apply to college and we're having to compete with other people who maybe didn't have the resources in those first 12 to 13 years, and we think that's unfair. This is how white privilege works at a mental level, right? If I'm used to getting 100% of the stuff, or maybe 85% of the stuff, and now you tell me that I'm only going to get maybe 65 or 70%, to me that seems like the end of the world, but that's not the result of discrimination. That's the result of a fair competition. The only way that white folks could actually believe that was discriminatory is if they fundamentally think, and I'm afraid many do, that white folks, and particularly white men, are just that much smarter. We're somehow genetically or culturally superior, because unless that's the case, we're not supposed to have 85% of the stuff. If we'd had equity all this time, we wouldn't have had anywhere near 85% of the stuff. So in a way, white privilege has set us up to perceive even a fair competition as discriminatory, because we're used to all of it, and now we're only going to get our share of it. And I'm afraid that that's the way that, in some ways, privilege sets you up for a fall. It leads you to have unrealistic expectations of what fairness looks like.